When Jesus said, "a day's wage," everyone listening heard a specific number. We do not. And because we do not, most of the parables about money are being read slightly wrong. The widow puts 2 small coins in the treasury, and we are told it was everything she had. But how much was it? The workers in the vineyard argue about a denarius. Was that generous or insulting? Judas takes 30 pieces of silver, and we know it was a betrayal, but was it a fortune or was it almost nothing? These are not trivia questions. In several of these stories, the entire point turns on the amount, and the original audience did the arithmetic instantly, the way you would if someone told you a man was paid £9 an hour. This is what money actually was in 1st century Judea, what it bought, what it cost to live, and what happens to a dozen familiar passages once you can hear the numbers the way the first listeners did. Start with the coin you meet most often, because almost everything else is priced against it. The denarius was a small silver coin, about 18 millimeters across, roughly the weight of a modern penny. It carried the emperor's head, which is the entire basis of one of the most famous exchanges in the Gospels, when Jesus asks whose image is on the coin and is told Caesar's. And its value is stated plainly in the New Testament itself. In the parable of the workers in the vineyard, the landowner agrees with the laborers for a denarius a day. So, 1 denarius, 1 day of unskilled agricultural labor, from dawn until evening. That is the anchor. Every other price in this world can be converted into days of a working man's life, which is a far more useful measure than trying to convert to modern currency, because the relative cost of things has changed so completely that a pound figure would mislead you more than it helped. Bread is the obvious place to test it, and the New Testament gives us a price directly, though from an unsettling source. In Revelation, one of the horsemen carries a set of scales, and a voice announces a measure of wheat for a denarius and 3 measures of barley for a denarius. The measure named is roughly a liter or so of grain, about what one adult eats in a day. That is the point of the passage. It is not a shopping list, it is a famine price. A full day's wages buying one person's daily bread means a laborer with a family cannot feed them. The scales in the writer's hand are rationing, and the audience heard the arithmetic before they heard the theology, which tells us something about normal prices. For that to land as catastrophe, ordinary bread must have cost a fraction of a day's wage, perhaps an eighth, perhaps a 12th, depending on the year and the harvest. Food was cheap in good years and lethal in bad ones, and the gap between the two was one failed harvest. Now the smaller coins, because this is where the widow's story lives. Below the denarius, the currency ran down through a series of bronze pieces. Mark tells us the widow put in 2 lepta and then does something unusual. He stops to explain the value to his readers, who were evidently Roman and did not know the local coinage. He says the 2 lepta made a quadrans. The lepton was the smallest coin in circulation in Judea. Estimates place it at somewhere around 1/128th of a denarius, though the ratios varied. So the widow's gift, in the measure we have been using, is a few minutes of a laborer's day, perhaps 5. It would not buy a loaf. Hold that against the sentence that follows it. She has cast in more than they all. That statement is not sentiment. It is a claim about proportion, made in front of a treasury where the wealthy were putting in large sums, by a man who then says she gave everything she had to live on while they gave out of their surplus. And the surrounding numbers make it sharper. The temple treasury took in enormous amounts. Herod's temple was one of the great construction projects of the ancient world, and the annual half-shekel tax alone, paid by every adult Jewish male across the empire, produced a river of silver flowing into Jerusalem. Against that, 5 minutes of a poor woman's labor. The original hearers knew both figures. We generally know neither. Then there is the 30 pieces of silver, which is the number most often misunderstood in the whole gospel. It is usually read as a large bribe, the price of a man's life, a fortune worth betraying a friend for. It was not. The Gospels do not specify the coin, but the strong likelihood is the shekel, or a Tyrian equivalent, worth roughly 4 denarii. 30 of those comes to about 120 denarii. 120 days of labor, 4 months' wages for a working man. That is a meaningful sum. It is not nothing. But it is nowhere near a fortune. It will not buy a house or a field of any size, and it would not change the life of a man with access to the disciples' common purse. And the figure is not chosen for its size. It is a quotation. In Exodus, the compensation set for a slave gored to death by an ox is 30 shekels of silver. That is the statutory value of a slave, not a person, but a piece of property destroyed. And in Zechariah, there is a strange passage where the prophet asks for his wages and is weighed out 30 pieces of silver. And God tells him, with heavy sarcasm, to throw it to the potter, that lordly price at which I was valued by them. Matthew quotes it directly when Judas throws the money into the temple, and the priests use it to buy a potter's field. So the number is doing 2 jobs at once. It is a real sum, about 4 months' income. And it is the price of a dead slave, quoted from the law, applied to the Son of God. The first hearers caught both. We usually catch neither, because we do not have the wage rate in our heads, and we have not read Zechariah. Now the parable where the arithmetic does the most work, and where getting it wrong changes the meaning completely. A servant owes his king 10,000 talents. The talent was not a coin, it was a unit of weight, and an enormous one. Estimates put it at something like 6,000 denarii. So 10,000 talents is 60 million days of labor. That is not a large debt. It is a nonsensical debt. It is more money than existed in the region. For comparison, the annual tax revenue of the entire territory of Judea, Samaria and Idumea in that period was in the hundreds of talents. This man owes tens of thousands. The number is a joke, and it is meant to be. The audience would have laughed at it, the way you would laugh at someone saying they owed the bank £1 trillion. It is deliberately, ludicrously unpayable, which is exactly why the king's decision to cancel it lands as it does. And then the same servant goes out and finds a fellow servant who owes him 100 denarii. 100 days' wages, 4 months, real money, a serious sum to an ordinary man worth going to court over. The parable is not contrasting a huge debt with a tiny one. It is contrasting an impossible one with a perfectly ordinary one. The second debt is legitimate. That is what makes the servant's behavior so ugly. He is entirely within his rights, and he has just been released from something no lifetime of work could clear. Read without the numbers. It is a story about being ungrateful. Read with them. It is a story about the difference in scale between what has been forgiven you and what you are being asked to forgive, and the ratio is roughly 600,000 to 1. The parable of the talents changes too. A man going on a journey gives his servants 5 talents, 2 talents, and 1 talent respectively. In modern retellings, this is usually flattened into some money, and the word talent has drifted in English to mean an aptitude, which is a meaning it acquired from this very parable. But 1 talent is around 6,000 denarii, some 16 to 20 years of a laborer's wages. Even the servant who receives the least is handed a sum that a working man could not accumulate in his lifetime. Nobody in that story is given a small amount. The one who buries his portion in the ground is burying a fortune. And burying money was not eccentric. In a world without banks as we know them, and with no policing worth the name, a hole in the ground was a recognized way to secure wealth. Rabbinic sources treat burial as the responsible option, and a man who buried a deposit was legally protected if it was stolen. Which means the third servant's defense is better than it sounds to us. He did the safe, conventional, legally sound thing. That is what makes the master's reaction bracing rather than obvious. And then there is the day laborer parable, where the whole dispute is about a single denarius. The landowner hires men at dawn for a denarius. He hires more at 9, at noon, at 3, and at 5 in the afternoon. At the end of the day, he pays them all the same. The men who worked 12 hours are furious, and their complaint is precise. These last have worked only 1 hour, and thou hast made them equal unto us, which have borne the burden and heat of the day. To feel that properly, you need to know what a day laborer's life was. These were not employees. They were men who stood in the marketplace hoping to be picked, and who did not eat if they were not. There was no work tomorrow guaranteed. A denarius was 1 day's survival for a household. So the men hired at 5 in the afternoon were not lazy. They had stood there all day, and nobody had chosen them. The text says exactly that, because no man hath hired us. They were facing a night with nothing. The landowner's decision is not about fairness in wages. It is about whether a family eats. And the first worker's anger is not greed either. It is the entirely human reaction of people who worked 12 hours in the heat, watching someone paid the same for 1. The numbers are the entire argument, and the parable is unintelligible without them. 2 more quickly, because they are commonly misread in the same way. The Good Samaritan takes the injured man to an inn and gives the innkeeper 2 denarii, promising to cover any further cost. 2 days' wages, enough for perhaps a week or 2 of lodging at ancient rates. It is not a token, and it is not a fortune. It is a specific, practical, sufficient amount, from a man who then walks away leaving an open-ended guarantee with a stranger. The open guarantee is the extraordinary part, not the coins. And the woman with the alabaster jar of ointment, which the disciples object could have been sold for 300 denarii. That is a year's wages, near enough, poured out in a single gesture. Their objection is not petty. It is the reaction of anyone watching a year's income disappear in a minute. Before the wider economy, the money itself, because there was no single currency, and that fact explains one of the most misread scenes in the Gospels. 3 separate coinage systems circulated in Judea at the same time. There was Roman imperial money, the silver denarius, and the bronze pieces below it. There was Greek money left over from centuries of Hellenistic rule and still minted in the eastern cities. the drachma, roughly equivalent to a denarius, and the larger tetradrachm. And there was local Jewish coinage, small bronze issues struck by the Hasmoneans and by Herod and his sons, deliberately without human images, because of the commandment against graven likenesses. That last point matters enormously. Roman silver carried the emperor's portrait and an inscription describing him as the son of the divine Augustus. Carrying it was unavoidable. Bringing it into the temple was another matter, which is what the money changers were for. The temple required an annual tax of half a shekel from every adult Jewish male. It could not be paid in Roman denarii, partly because of the image and partly because the sum was specified in a different unit. In practice, the accepted coin was the Tyrian shekel, a silver piece from the city of Tyre, which had the enormous advantage of being reliably high purity and the awkward disadvantage of carrying the head of the god Melkart. So the temple accepted a coin with a pagan deity on it because it was the most trustworthy silver available. The purity mattered more than the portrait. That is a genuinely surprising piece of practical theology, and it is rarely mentioned. The changers sat in the outer court, converting whatever pilgrims arrived with into Tyrian silver and taking a commission for it. That commission is the thing. A pilgrim who had traveled from Egypt or Asia Minor had no choice. He could not pay the tax in the money he had, and the only place to change it was there. It was not a scandal in itself. Somebody had to do it, and a fee for the service is not theft. The question that hangs over the scene where Jesus overturns the tables is whether the rate had become exploitative, and on that the ancient sources are less clear than most retellings suggest. What is not in doubt is the structure, a compulsory religious payment in a currency most worshippers did not hold, exchangeable in one place, at a rate they could not negotiate. The same applied to sacrificial animals. A pilgrim could bring his own, but it had to pass inspection for blemishes, and buying one already approved inside the precinct removed that risk. Convenient and priced accordingly. Now what things cost, so the wages mean something. Our sources here are patchy and have to be handled with care. Much of what survives comes from Egypt, from Roman price edicts of later centuries, or from rabbinic material written down after the period. Prices varied by region, by year, and violently by harvest, but the broad shape is recoverable. A sheep might run to a few denarii. An ox, being both expensive and a capital asset, could reach the equivalent of several months' wages, which is why the man in the parable who has bought 5 yoke of oxen is signaling considerable wealth, not making an excuse about a small purchase. A simple tunic was not cheap. Clothing was hand-spun and hand-woven, and the labor in it was enormous. A garment could represent weeks of work, which is why clothes appear in the Gospels as things people own singly rather than in quantity, and why the instruction to give away your cloak is a serious demand rather than a gesture. The cloak was also legally protected as a debt pledge. Exodus requires it returned by nightfall because a poor man slept in it. Housing in a village was mud, brick, or rough stone, often a single room shared with the animals at one end, with a flat roof used for sleeping and drying. That is the house in the story where 4 men dig through the roof to lower a paralyzed friend, a roof of beams, branches, and packed earth, which could be opened and repaired, rather than the tiled structure most illustrations show. A day laborer's household, then, lived on roughly a denarius a day when work was available, ate bread and olives and salt fish with vegetables, drank watered wine, owned very little cloth, and had no capacity to absorb a bad month. And skilled work paid better, but not transformatively. A craftsman, a tekton, the word used of Joseph, meaning a builder or worker in wood and stone rather than specifically a furniture maker, might earn a multiple of the laborer's rate, but he was still selling his hands by the day. The distance between that and real wealth was not a ladder, it was a wall. Now step back from the parables to the economy underneath them, because the numbers only make sense inside it. This was a society where most people lived very close to the line. Estimates of the ancient Mediterranean economy generally put a large majority of the population at or near subsistence, with a very thin layer of the extremely wealthy above them, and almost nothing in between. There was no middle class in the modern sense. Taxation was heavy and layered. There was the Roman tribute. There were tolls and customs at borders and roads, which is what tax collectors like Matthew and Zacchaeus were collecting and why they were hated. The system worked by selling the right to collect and letting the collector keep the excess. There was the temple tax. There were tithes on agricultural produce. Estimates of the total burden on a Galilean farmer vary widely, but the figures proposed run from a fifth of production to well over a third. Debt was consequently everywhere, and it was dangerous. Defaulting could mean losing your land, and losing your land meant becoming a day laborer, which is how a family fell out of the small holding class in one bad generation and never came back. That is the context for a striking number of Jesus's stories. Debtors, stewards, landowners, absentee masters, men hired by the day, people losing a single coin and turning the house over to find it. It is not accidental that the vocabulary of forgiveness in the Gospels is borrowed wholesale from the vocabulary of debt cancellation. The word translated, forgive, is the ordinary commercial term for releasing an obligation. When the Lord's Prayer says, forgive us our debts, it is using a word the audience heard at the market. It also explains a phrase that has been thoroughly domesticated in English. When Jesus says you cannot serve God and mammon, the word is not a synonym for money, and it is not the name of a demon, whatever later tradition made of it. Mammon is an Aramaic word for wealth or property, specifically the stuff a person relies on. It carries the sense of that in which you put your trust, which turns the sentence from a warning about greed into something more uncomfortable. It is not about loving money too much. It is about what you are actually depending on when the harvest fails. And in a society where a bad season could move a family from owning land to selling their labor by the day, that dependence was not abstract. Everyone in the audience knew somebody it had happened to. The same goes for the word usually rendered as treasure, in the instruction about laying up treasure in heaven where moth and rust do not corrupt, and thieves do not break through and steal. That is a list of the 3 actual threats to stored wealth in the 1st century: cloth eaten by insects, metal corroding, and coin dug out of the floor of your house. It is not poetry, it is an inventory of how savings were lost. Which brings us to the woman who lost a coin. She loses 1 drachma, roughly a denarius, and lights a lamp and sweeps the house and searches until she finds it, and then calls her friends together because she is so pleased. Told without the economics, this looks like an overreaction to losing a small coin. Told with them, it is a woman who has lost a day of survival in a house with a dirt or stone floor, one small window, and no lighting except a clay lamp, which is why she has to light it in the daytime to search at all. Some scholars suggest the 10 coins may have been part of a marriage headdress or dowry set, which would make the loss worse still. That reading is contested, and I would not lean on it. The plain economic reading is enough. A day's wage is a lot to a woman sweeping her own floor to find it. There are 3 more passages where the money is the whole point and almost nobody notices. The first is the coin in the fish's mouth. Peter is asked whether his teacher pays the temple tax, and Jesus sends him to catch a fish in whose mouth he will find a stater. The stater was worth 4 drachmas, exactly 2 half shekels, precisely enough for 2 men. Not a bag of gold, not a miracle of abundance, the exact sum required for Jesus and Peter, and not a coin more. The restraint in that number is the point. It is the smallest possible miracle that solves the actual problem, and the amount tells you so. The second is Zacchaeus, who is not simply a tax collector, but a chief tax collector, a man who held a franchise and had others collecting beneath him, which is why Luke bothers to say he was rich. And what he promises is specific: half of his goods to the poor and fourfold restitution to anyone he has defrauded. Fourfold is not a number he invented. It is the penalty set in Exodus for stolen livestock that has been sold or slaughtered, the harshest restitution rate in the law. He is not offering a donation. He is sentencing himself under the maximum available provision, voluntarily, in public. And half his goods on top of that. The rabbinic guidance of the period generally discouraged giving away more than 1/5 of one's wealth, on the practical grounds that a man who impoverishes himself becomes a burden on the community. Zacchaeus goes to 50% and then adds the criminal penalty. The crowd doing the arithmetic would have understood that he had effectively liquidated himself. The third is the rich young ruler, and it turns on a phrase that gets flattened in translation. He is told to sell what he has and give to the poor, and Mark says he went away sorrowful, for he had great possessions. The word for possessions there is about property, land and holdings, not coin. That is a different kind of wealth from a full purse, and a much harder one to liquidate. Land in that society was inherited, tied to family and tribe, and connected to identity in a way money never was. Selling it did not merely make you poorer, it removed you from the structure that told everyone who you were. Which is why the instruction lands as heavily as it does, and why the disciples respond with astonishment rather than approval. They are not shocked that a rich man was asked to be generous. They are shocked that he was asked to stop being who he was. And there is one more figure worth holding, because it sets the scale of everything else. Herod's temple was among the largest religious complexes in the ancient world. Josephus describes stones in its foundations of extraordinary size, some measuring many meters in length. The construction employed thousands of men for decades, and it was still being finished in Jesus' lifetime, which is why, in John, the crowd says the temple has been 46 years in building. That entire project ran on the same economy as the widow's 2 coins. The half-shekel tax, gathered from every adult Jewish male across the empire and carried to Jerusalem, tithes and offerings, the trade in animals and currency in the outer court. So when a poor woman drops in the smallest coins available, She is contributing to the largest building program in the region, alongside men whose single donations could have fed her village for a year. Both things were true at once, and the man watching said the smaller sum was the larger gift. So what do we do with all of this? The first thing is simply to slow down at every number. When a figure appears in a parable, it is doing work. The gospel writers were not decorating. The amounts are load-bearing, and they were chosen for an audience that could price them instantly. The second is to notice how consistently the arithmetic sharpens the point rather than softening it. The widow gives less than we thought, and it means more. Judas takes less than we thought, and it is worse, because the number is a quotation about the price of a slave. The unforgiving servant's own debt is more absurd than we thought, and the debt he refuses to cancel is more reasonable. In every case, the real figure makes the story harder, not easier. And the third is what the whole economic picture says about who these stories were told to. They are full of hired men, lost coins, unpayable debts, absent landlords, and the terror of a bad harvest. That is not the furniture of a comfortable audience. It is the world of people who knew exactly what a denarius meant, because their next meal depended on whether they had one. There is one more number that changes how a famous exchange reads. When the crowd asks whether it is lawful to pay the tax to Caesar, and Jesus asks whose image is on the coin in question is a denarius, and specifically the Roman denarius carrying the head of Tiberius. The inscription running around that portrait declares him the son of the divine Augustus. On the reverse, a seated figure and a legend naming him high priest. So the object being held up in the temple courts is not neutral currency. It is a small piece of imperial religious propaganda, and everyone handling it knew exactly what it said, because they read it every time they counted their wages. That is why the question was a trap in both directions. Say do not pay, and you are inciting revolt against Rome. Say pay, and you are endorsing a coin that calls a man divine inside the temple, where that coin was not even accepted. And it is why the detail that they had to produce one matters. He did not have it in his own hand. They did. The tax itself was the tributum, the head tax levied on the province, and it was one of the direct grievances that had driven an armed revolt within living memory of the people standing there. A denarius a year per adult, paid in Roman coin. 1 day of labor, handed to an occupying power in money that named its emperor a god. Understanding that the coin was a day's wage is one layer. Understanding what was stamped on it is the other. Together they turn a clever riposte into something far sharper than most readings allow. And there is a caution worth stating before anyone takes these figures too far, because I have been giving them with more confidence than the evidence always supports. Ancient prices are genuinely difficult. A great deal of what survives comes from Egypt, where the papyri happen to have lasted, and Egypt was not Judea. Rabbinic material is invaluable, but was written down after the period it describes. Roman price data often comes from later centuries or from imperial edicts that were attempts to control prices rather than records of them. Purchasing power also does not convert cleanly across 2,000 years. A denarius bought a day of unskilled labor, and that is solid because the New Testament says so. But converting it to a modern figure requires deciding whether you are matching the wage, the price of bread, or the cost of a house. And those three give wildly different answers, because the relative price of food, labor, and land has changed completely. That is why I have kept almost everything in days of labor rather than pounds. It is the one measure the original audience and a modern one can both feel. What is not in doubt is the shape, that a denarius was a day, that the smallest coin was a tiny fraction of it, that a talent was a working lifetime, and that 10,000 of them was a deliberate absurdity. Those relationships are internal to the texts and do not depend on any archaeological price list at all. 2 small coins, 5 minutes of a working day. She cast in more than they all, and the man who said it had just watched the wealthy file past with sums she could not have earned in a lifetime. He was not making a point about generosity in the abstract. He was doing arithmetic out loud, in front of people who could follow it instantly, and arriving at an answer that inverted the entire visible order of the courtyard. Once you can hear the numbers the way that crowd heard them, the parables stop being gentle moral tales about being nice with money. They become precise, and in several places genuinely shocking, statements about debt, wages, obligation, and worth, spoken to an audience who knew to the last small coin exactly what was being described.